Hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's Ipieca webinar to introduce our new guidance and tools on managing labour rights. I'm afraid that Rebecca Collicott's unable to join today, so instead you have me. I'm Amelia Knott. I'm a human rights consultant with Ipieca, and I'd first like to welcome and thank our speaker, Matt Waller from Ergon Associates, who has been working with Ipieca on developing the labour rights guidance and tools. Both of our bios are shown on your webinar console, so welcome Matt. Would you like to say a couple of words?
Hello, thank you very much to Ipieca for having me today, and to Amelia as well. Just for those of you who don't know us, Ergon Associates are a specialist consultancy working on labour standards, human rights and gender. We work with clients across a number of sectors and industries, including extractors in oil and gas, and we've recently been doing a bunch of work looking into issues on human rights impact assessments, providing support on the development of grievance mechanisms, and sort of helping build labour practices into procurement and contractor management for various clients.
Fantastic, thank you Matt. Before we begin, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. So at the bottom of your screen are multiple application tools that you can use. All the tools are resizable and movable, so do feel free to just move them around and get the most out of your desktop space. And you can expand your slide area or maximise it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. The slides that we'll go through today are also going to be available in the resource list if you'd like to download them. And this webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. Now you might find that some networks cause the slides to advance a bit more slowly than others. So if you're finding this is a problem, you can try things like logging off your corporate VPN, using F5 on your keyboard to refresh, or follow any prompts to enable flash. There is also a help feature at the bottom of your screen should you forget any of those instructions. And an on-demand version of this webinar will be available approximately a day afterwards, and you can use it with the same audience link that you were sent earlier. So for the best viewing experience, I recommend closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background. Now, if you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A tool at any point. Now, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the guidance, and then we're going to do this in the form of a discussion. So I'm going to be asking Matt a number of questions all about the guidance and how it can be put into practice, and then he'll be taking questions from you, the audience, and answering those as well. So we will try to answer as many questions as possible during this webinar, but if there is a fuller answer needed or we run out of time, then we will answer them later via email. Okay, so I just wanted to start with some background on why Ipieca wanted to develop labour rights guidance. We're a consensus-based and member-led organisation, and labour rights is a priority for one of our member groups, the social responsibility group, for a whole range of reasons. I mean, we're currently seeing very strong interest from external stakeholders who want to know much more about what companies are doing in this area. And there is, of course, the evolving regulatory context. Both in terms of things like the UK Modern Slavery Act and the Australian Modern Slavery Act, which are kind of in the home countries where oil and gas companies are headquartered, but also we're seeing labour law reforms in many of the host countries where they operate as well. But one of the reasons that we wanted to focus on labour rights was that in contrast to other sectors, we felt there was a limited availability of things that were specific for the oil and gas industry and tools for those practitioners who are responsible for managing these issues. So as part of its broader work on labour rights, the Social Responsibility Group wanted to develop the guidance in order to do three main things. One was to enable members to more effectively identify, prevent and mitigate labour rights risks and impacts within projects, operations and supply chains. Secondly, the guidance is to support Ipieca's members to anticipate emerging trends and challenges. And thirdly, to inform stakeholders about the industry's collective commitment and efforts to respect labour rights. So, over the course of the last year, Ergon has been consulting with Ipieca's members and international experts on these subject areas to develop a suite of practical implementation guidance and supporting tools. And you can see at a glance on the screen now what that guidance looks like, which was launched in March, the end of March. So there are a number of documents there. There's an awareness brief on company and supply chain labour rights in the oil and gas industry. There is guidance on responsible recruitment. which covers considerations on responsible recruitment and employment, and it also outlines key labour rights issues that's going to be addressed during a project life cycle, and identifies risks, emerging good practice, and considerations for effective management. There's also a labour rights assessment protocol and toolkit, which outlines approaches for conducting assurance of on-site contractors following contract commencement. This document also provides examples from oil and gas companies and other industries, and it's supported by two tools. So there is a tool for on-site labour rights assessment and checklist as well for on-site labour rights assessments. And then the final document is guidance on worker grievance mechanisms, and this provides examples of good practice from Ipieca members and other industries that have enabled workers to speak up and have their concerns acknowledged and addressed. So that's a quick overview as to why we worked on the guidance and what its purpose is and what it looks like, and all these things are available on Ipieca's website. So now it's Matt's turn. So Matt, labour rights issues aren't new to this sector, obviously, and there are some companies that have spent many years working to address such issues. Why is it that you think this guidance is important now, and how do you think the industry compares, the oil and gas industry compares with other sectors?
Good question. I think part of the reasons for why it's important now, you've just outlined in your introduction. I think the sort of, emerging legislation and new existing legislation on modern slavery and various human rights due diligence is really driving companies, and especially senior management, to start looking at these issues in a lot more detail, because they're essentially having to report on them. I think this is linked to increased investor attention and the expectations that they have on their sort of portfolio to demonstrate that they're doing due diligence on sort of significant labour rights issues, and those have considerable commercial implications for companies. I think additionally there's business case reasons for doing this. It's an important thing. I've recently been on a project where there were various violations of working hours, wages, health and safety issues, which are having significant impacts on productivity, morale, absenteeism, which essentially have higher costs. So I think doing better in that area has an important role in sort of improving business outcomes. And as you said, I think it's important now because there are significant labour impacts associated with oil and gas projects all over the world, whether it's in the sort of developed or developing world at different stages. So it's good to start trying to get our hands dirty and starting to address this issue more proactively. In terms of where the sector stands in relation to other sectors, I think rightly the oil and gas sector has been paying a lot of attention in recent years to environmental and community-related impacts, which are significant and which have been more proactively addressed probably to date than more of the labour issues. But so maybe a bit behind other sort of typical supply chain, garment, food manufacturing sectors, for example. But as a result, actually has quite a lot of learnings that they can take from the mistakes that have been made in previous years by those other sectors. So I think there's a good opportunity at the moment.
Fantastic. And who can or should be using this guidance within oil and gas companies, and what practical tips do you have for implementing it?
Yeah, so I think as you described, there's a number of tools and sort of guidance documents within this suite of outputs. And I think so the document on responsible recruitment and employment is really sort of focused on large-scale projects in sensitive geographies with vulnerable workforces. And so it's for individuals that work either at sort of head office or project level in relation to those sorts of projects to try and build their understanding capacity in relation to identifying issues or addressing those issues. So really reading that and sort of using it as a sort of prompt to sort of build awareness, both for maybe sustainability teams, but more broadly amongst other colleagues who may have an impact. The deliverables on labour rights assessments, we have essentially they should be for individuals who have a good working knowledge of labour issues and are responsible for either carrying out or commissioning some sort of on-site labour assessment, a detailed assessment, and it requires a sort of good understanding of some of the sort of basic issues. But attached to that, there is this more overarching, simple, a guidance tool which is for individuals who may spend a lot of time on site or visiting sites, but who don't have the specialist expertise. So it's just a few sort of key things for them to consider to identify some issues and escalate that internally within the company. And then for worker grievances, on that document, it's anyone involved in managing worker grievances. So if that's a human resources manager or team member, individuals who work directly in terms of like workforce relations, contract managers who may be responsible for dealing with, their contractors and subcontractors. So yeah, all across the board there.
That's really helpful to understand. I want to get into some of the nuts and bolts now of the different guidance documents. But it's great to hear the range of people that should be using this. Yes. So one of the guidance documents deals with responsible recruitment and employment, and it's got guidance to support practitioners to identify labour risks. Can you explain a bit more how this guidance supports companies to do this?
Yeah, so as I just mentioned, this document's really sort of designed to sort of build an understanding of labour issues and sort of trying to support individuals identify where labour issues may exist. And this has really been based on our discussions with various Ipieca members, other stakeholders and experts to really build a picture of what the sort of issue sort of framework looks like. And so in this document we provide an overview of a sort of project life cycle from sort of design through to decommissioning, and sort of give an overview of where sort of labour risks may be highest. And I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone listening, but it's typically construction, where you have large numbers of low-skilled workers brought in for sort of short time periods to deliver work, where some of these risks may be greatest. So we talk about that, but we also sort of look at some of the other sort of design, delivery, and sort of operational phases, which may have specific types of risks as well. We also sort of provide this overview of the 8 common indicators of risk. And this isn't to say that these are all the indicators, but I think commonly across many of the projects that we've worked on and that various stakeholders have also worked on, it was worth calling these out. And so these can be used as a sort of screening at any stage of a project, really, whether it's prior to contracts being let or during monitoring, to sort of try and understand where risks are greatest. And this is broken down into sort of 3 broad categories. So we've got worker characteristics, and within that we look at sort of low-skilled workers as a sort of key sort of high-risk workforce type, but also their origin. So that typically relates to individuals who've migrated internally or from other countries, who may be more vulnerable to sort of exploitative recruitment practices. We've also got another sort of segment which is on management practices, so where there is evidence of poor management systems, so there's no sort of contractor management plans, there's a lack of policy, there's a lack of capacity amongst key personnel, and where there's widespread subcontracting, because we all know the sort of further away the various sort of contractor is from your company, there tends to be less oversight, less management of risk, and perhaps more informality associated with their practices. And then broader contextual risks. So we've got issues around work in remote areas where there's potentially a lack of oversight of workplace conditions, poor legal protections within a particular country where labour law, for example, doesn't sufficiently cover the employment relationship. And we also have widespread discrimination in a country which may relate to particular ethnic groups, minorities, women, for example, but then also where there have been cost fluctuations in the sector, and where there may be a sort of large reduction in the number of workers, that could lead to specific issues for workers as well. And then sort of finally, to sort of bring the picture onto the worker, really, we've sort of given an overview as to what the sort of typical employment journey is for a migrant worker, though some of these will be very relevant to any worker really on a project. So we just tried to sort of spell out various phases or sort of touch points of a worker's recruitment and employment journey, and sort of give a brief explanation as to how these may cause or lead to a sort of higher risk associated with their rights being violated.
Fantastic. So when a company gets all this risk information, all about their projects and their supply chains, they've gathered it all, what practically then should they be doing with it?
Yes, so I think lots of risk information isn't very useful to anyone. I think we call it, this big red map of misery when you're provided with, globally it's red everywhere in every country that you operate. That's not of much use. So I think the key, that we try to sort of spell out in this document is to prioritize and to look into, which rights issues are most salient. And where the sort of leverage and responsibility lies within a project or in a particular supply chain. And so when we talk about saliency and doing a saliency analysis, we basically propose doing some sort of measure of severity of right being impacted and the likelihood of that occurring, so some sort of assessment there. And then mapping that against the degree of leverage and responsibility that your company has. So take forced labour, for example, obviously a very severe rights impact that potentially is actually quite unlikely, so that would potentially reduce its saliency. And if it's further away down a sort of supply chain it's associated with subcontractor practices, that will inform how you want to address that issue. And you can do that for a number of rights issues. In terms of the prioritisation process, this is one means of doing that. It's not the only one out there, but we found it in our practice, and others have found it also useful in terms of focusing attention. I think the ultimate aim after doing that is to really drive companies towards some sort of action and not just, again, sitting there on the risk information that they have. So within the guidance, we also have a number of sort of good practice principles for individuals that sit within various functions, either at an oil and gas company or within their sort of EPCs and construction companies. And the good practices relate to what can be done sort of prior to contracts being let and sort of during project implementation. So we have guidance related to compliance personnel, procurement personnel, individuals involved in setting standards and contract management, and also people in sort of human resources departments and workforce relations. And the aim is really to try and sort of embed these sort of labour rights principles and practices across an organisation, so it's not just sat with one individual and it becomes more systematised.
Brilliant. Well, another of the guidance areas that was focused on is workplace labour assessments. And as I've already mentioned, it includes a detailed guidance note on how to carry out the labour assessment and a supporting tool with specific questions to ask and guidance on interpreting the findings. Before we get on to the specifics of this, I wanted you to say a few words about preparation and preparing for an assessment, and wondered if you could share some thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think typically, anyone who's done any form of sort of assessments on labour standards on a project knows that preparation is very important. It helps clarify your objectives, the focus of your visit, sorting out scheduling and generally making things run a lot more smoothly. And I think sort of the key considerations in the preparation should be, well, firstly, check the contracts to see what degree of assessment or auditing or monitoring is permitted in that. We had a case once where we turned up on site for a client to do a labour assessment, and the management simply refused us access because they claimed that the monitoring clause within the contract was not specific enough as to what we were asking them to do. And this determines what type of assessments you want to do and you can do. So do you want to turn up unannounced? Do you want to give the management warning about your the time that you're going to come? Do you want to sort of do a blend of both? And there are pros and cons to the different approaches, but generally, we try and take a sort of a collaborative approach to doing these sorts of assessments, as it can lead to sort of a bit more hostility from management if you turn up out of the blue asking all these questions. I'd say as much as possible in advance, getting information about the sites and what sort of procedures and policies they have in advance is particularly useful. And this would, this helps inform, what you're going to do, who you're going to speak to. So it's important to know the number of workers, their sort of nationalities, their sort of their gender, the time that the project's been running for, the extent to which there are management systems in place, whether they're sort of environmental and social management plans, specific contractor management plans, labour management plans, what sorts of policies are in place to sort of regulate that employment relationship and the sort of contracting dynamics on a site, because that will help inform who you want to speak to and about what. And then also doing some degree of just the sort of background risk review and assessment, so understanding what the law says, what the context is in that country, in that sector, so you can understand where there may be legal gaps which sort of highlight particular vulnerabilities. This can all be done sort of as a desk-based review. You can also do sort of essentially internet searches to understand if there are particular issues associated with that sector in that country, even particular companies, and then use this as an opportunity to sort of do a bit of an analysis on their data prior to going. And then I guess not really the final bit, but as part of this process, just determining who your assessment team is. If you're turning up on a site with 5,000 South Asian workers, for example, it's probably important that you have someone that can speak to those individuals in their language, that can build trust and foster dialogue with them, rather than, say, me as a British man just turning up and trying to do the same. Doesn't really work out as well. So some key sort of considerations there.
It sounds like the preparation bit is absolutely fundamental to getting this right.
Yes.
And the guidance, I know, has some useful templates and quite specific things in there, which is really helpful. Okay, so once we've prepared the assessment and we're referring back to this tool, it's all well and good. It's obviously well known that such assessments are important tools for monitoring a particular site's working conditions. But auditing an assessment, the approaches aren't always necessarily that effective.
No.
So once the assessment is underway, what tips are in the guidance, or what does the guidance help you do to make sure that the assessment is as robust as possible?
Sure. So I think for those of you who've read it, you'll see that there's a lot of information across the sort of key guidance documents and the tool itself, the sort of supporting tool. Maybe if I just start with the sort of guidance document itself, I think it gives quite a detailed overview of the how, in terms of how to sort of go about doing things, and so it sets out all the preparation information that I've just discussed, but then gives an idea of who you need to speak to and specifically about what, and also the sort of manner in which those individuals need to be engaged with. So there is advice and guidance on the opening sort of meeting with management upon arrival. There's guidance on the sort of key focus areas and the sort of manner of conducting other management interviews with primarily with human resources and procurement personnel. There's also sort of guidance and an overview on how to sort of interrogate documentation and other sort of bits of information that you'll be receiving on the site. And then there's also quite a lot of detail on the worker interview process itself, in terms of how to go about that, in terms of fostering good dialogue with the workers and getting the best information from them, because that's often the trickiest, well, not often, it's regularly a tricky component of any labour assessment, is getting sort of reliable, accurate information from workers who, for various reasons, may not be willing to share that with you. So there's good guidance in there in terms of how to make them feel more comfortable, how to sort of go about your questioning, and some sort of considerations in terms of the planning there, and then the actual delivery of those worker interviews. And so that's all set out in the guidance document, which also includes a number of sort of steps and approaches to actually sort of developing actions, so responding to the issues that you've identified over the course of the assessment. And what we try to do is give a sort of framework or a roadmap to addressing these issues and sort of developing those actions. So again, prioritising the sort of key risks that are in there, and essentially working with management on sites and getting worker input to develop actions that sort of address the overall root causes rather than just sort of giving unrealistic compliance-led sort of bandages to sort of much sort of bigger wounds essentially. And so all of this is set out in the guidance, and this is supported by the toolkit, which has a large number of very detailed questions related to key sort of labour standards areas, from child labour, forced labour, non-discrimination, freedom of association, but then also questions to interrogate management systems a bit more. And within this, there are questions that you would look for an answer for, evidence that you should also sort of be looking to use to support your finding there, but then also a 4-scale essentially scoring criteria from low risk to I think critical risk, if I remember correctly. And this can be used to essentially standardize how companies in the sector do these assessments, what the expectations are of oil and gas companies, of their business partners, and it's a way of sort of essentially standardizing the approach and helping make things much more consistent. And this is really useful because it can be used based on your prior risk assessment. You can sort of pick and choose which questions would be more important to answer, which areas should be focused on more than others. And if that isn't done, we also include a sort of core criteria, core questions that should be asked essentially on all project sites, and that's on one of the particular tabs. In addition to the sort of general questions to ask, there's also an accommodation inspection checklist. So this is in line with international good practice as determined by an IFC EBRD good practice guide on worker accommodation. And there's also some ideas on potential mitigation and remedial actions, which is on one of the tabs as well. So they're just ideas of what could be done in relation to some sort of common issues. But as I said before, it's probably best to take a sort of an approach to develop actions which is much more considered to a specific site using the framework that we set out in the guidance document. One final bit on this, because this is the biggest, this is the sort of largest suite of tools that we have developed for Ipieca. The final piece of guidance, as I mentioned, I think at the beginning, is this sort of quick reference tool which can be used by individuals who are visiting sites who may not have, or on sites who may not have specific expertise on the labour issues. And what we try to do here is just provide a very sort of simple framework in terms of things that they can consider and think about doing beforehand, during, and sort of after they've been on the site. So there's a sort of simple quick reference tool that we've developed which can be used and given out to colleagues and individuals that may have an interest and maybe going to a high-risk site. It essentially increases your opportunity to identify particularly sort of high-risk issues on your higher-risk site.
Fantastic. So the final part of the guidance for the suite of documents is on worker grievance mechanisms, and it includes lots of detailed information on the stages involved in handling a grievance. Now, in many respects, this is quite similar to how community grievances would be dealt with. But I think on projects where there are numerous contractors and subcontractors, it may be much more difficult to provide all workers with access to an effective grievance mechanism.
Yeah.
So how does this guidance propose overcoming that particular challenge?
Yes, often a very hard issue for any company to sort of address. I mean, grievance mechanisms, as you mentioned, have been sort of used a lot with community workers, and there's been a lot of sort of, I think, good Ipieca guidance and sectoral initiative and sort of leadership on this issue. But in relation to worker grievances, there are some things that these community grievances and mechanisms don't pick up. So it's necessary to think about what is in place already that may pick up grievances, how that relates to workers. So really sort of doing a review of the landscape of mechanisms and mapping who can raise grievances about what. and where they may be existing trade union processes and sort of mechanisms there. They may be the community mechanisms themselves. They may be audits. They may be sort of hotlines, boxes on importance of review, all of those sorts of entry points and mechanisms that follow up to those issues. And once you've identified those and done that mapping, to essentially review their effectiveness. So anyone familiar with the Ipieca guidance on community grievance mechanisms know that the sort of grievance mechanism standard, and in terms of what determines effectiveness of a grievance mechanism, relates to what's set out in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And this essentially sets out 7 key principles for any effective grievance mechanism, whether it's a worker grievance mechanism or a community grievance mechanism. So what we would recommend, and what the guidance recommends, is essentially doing a review of whether those mechanisms meet those effectiveness criteria and where the gaps may be, and where there are gaps in effectiveness, or there are gaps in actually the scope in terms of not capturing particular types of workers. So maybe subcontractor workers don't have access to any sort of grievance mechanism. It would be ideal to try and build capacity of third parties to receive and handle grievances effectively, but this isn't always the case. So essentially expanding your own worker grievance mechanism or community grievance mechanism to capture those workers and those sorts of concerns. And so, we're doing a big project at the moment, which is essentially that. It's looking at the landscape of grievance mechanisms in relation to particular rights holders, seeing what's there, reviewing whether they're effective or not, and then sort of our clients going to be taking on board recommendations to see how they can fill the gaps and support existing mechanisms, and where that's not possible, actually developing their own to sort of extend to those rights holders that they've identified as sort of being sort of high risk, essentially. A key, there are many key issues, but sort of key for any oil and gas company really expanding their own mechanism to some of the more vulnerable workers will be in terms of how that's communicated to those workers. Determining which complaints that you've received are within scope of the mechanism and who's responsible for dealing with it. Is it something you should do, or a contractor, or another state entity perhaps? And then how you should engage in the sort of follow-up and tracking and monitoring of that. These are all set out in the guidance in terms of considerations in terms of how to overcome these. So yeah, I think it's all there.
I think that's a really important key message, though, that you mentioned, is making use of what's there already, identifying what's there, and then building on it and filling the gaps. I think that's a crucial area. Okay, so I've got one more question for you before opening it up to the audience, and do type your questions into the Q&A tool if you have them. So having done this research and spoken to a lot of stakeholders, what opportunities do you see for collaboration on labour rights in the oil and gas industry?
Very good. I think in terms of collaboration, there's actually quite a lot of scope. I think the sort of increased international attention on labour through transparency legislation firstly means that this issue isn't going away. This is something that companies are increasingly realising, not just in sustainability teams, but across senior management level. And it's an opportunity really to use that momentum to drive practices and collaboration forward. And I think this evidenced by the guidance, this guidance itself. So in terms of collaboration, internal collaboration is really important. So getting senior management buy-in, this is a great opportunity for it. Getting buy-in from other departments to help them understand how their roles can both help identify and mitigate particular risks. Business partners, many companies will be subject to many of the same standards, national laws or investor standards or international standards. We spoke to a number of contractors and oil and gas companies who said about the other party, it would be great if they paid more attention to this. That it would be more likely that they would win projects. It would be more likely that we would bid for projects if there was a higher sort of focus on, more of a focus on labour standards, and more of a focus on the sort of, or more of an acknowledgement of those that may come at a higher cost. So I think that's really important. I think companies in the sector are sort of also very well placed to take advantage of their roles and connections. unlike many other sort of sectors, I suppose, oil and gas companies are global. They're all over the world. They have long-term existing projects in a particular geography and location. This gives them the opportunity to sort of, over time, slowly build strong ties with public and private sector partners, and to, where there are issues, to influence change. That's easier said than done, obviously, but that's a sort of unique sort of opportunity for the sector. I think there's a lot of sectoral initiatives and drive for this in this sort of area. We see in the construction sector various things happening in the Gulf, for example, with building responsibly. That's a sort of excellent sort of example of a sectoral initiative to address some of these issues with a number of sort of competing companies, essentially. And then I think finally the sort of size and geographic spread of oil and gas companies in particular allows them to address potentially like larger global labour issues. So I think we spoke with various companies in the research process who talked about overcoming some of the issues to do with migration and ethical recruitment by using their colleagues sat in another country where they were sending workers to the country that they were sat in to sort of better understand labour dynamics in that country and to sort of try and figure out how they could influence together sort of across borders, essentially.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much indeed, Matt, for talking us through the guidance and the tools. We now have the opportunity for some questions from the audience, and I can see that we've got one that's come in on the Sustainable Development Goals. So the question is, which SDGs do you think that this type of guidance helps to achieve meeting? Any more broadly than the SDG on health? And are there wider indirect benefits that follow from good workforce management? You've got 3 questions there. Should we start with which SDGs do you think that this type of guidance helps to meet?
I think if you take the SDG 8, which sort of talks a lot about decent work, that would be the sort of key SDG that I think this addresses, and that it helps essentially address that by identifying these issues and overcoming them. It talks a lot about collaboration and sort of using the sort of networks and partnerships that companies have to systematically address some of these sort of large issues, which often aren't just located on a specific project. They're often much more systemic across a particular country. So yeah, I think it goes beyond just health. I think a lot of the guidance is related to the health and safety dynamic of labour, but isn't actually just focused on that. And I think we've tried to move away from that because that's often a sort of, if you talk about worker welfare, for example, that's often considered just to be a health and safety issue. And we've tried to expand it into sort of some of these other more human resources issues, which are maybe less tangible for people to pick up on.
And also, the second part of that question, are there wider indirect benefits that follow from good workforce management?
I think there are a number. That's a good question. I think the point I made at the beginning around sort of essentially the business case for it, for sort of good labour management, I think leads to individuals who want to work for you, who stay longer, who are more productive. I know there's a number of studies and sort of pilots being done by companies in different parts of the world. But if you take an example from the construction sector, where Vinci in Qatar have really identified that there are significant issues with the way that they were recruiting and subcontracting workers, so they've taken it upon themselves to employ them directly, and they've seen sort of and invest in their training capacity building, give them opportunities in other projects globally. And apparently that sort of led to higher productivity, an initial higher cost, but over the long term the hope is that there will be fewer issues, fewer costs related to having to recruit new workers, etc., in addition to better management of their labour standards and sort of realising their rights.
And I imagine also it's linked to better influx management. When you're bringing in a large labour force to an area, it has an impact on a community.
Yeah.
And being able to manage that workforce well, I'm sure has wider community benefits too. Okay, another question, which is how does the toolkit address gender dimensions in the workplace and particularly sexual harassment?
I would say that that's probably one gap associated with the majority of the toolkit and guidance documents. I think the sort of key element which could be sort of taken out of the guidance to address that issue is from the worker grievance section, and that includes a specific section on how to deal with anonymous complaints and sort of confidential complaints, and that's really, the guidance there is really born out of good practice that's emerged from, I think it was the Australian public sector, but looking at how you can sensitively deal with issues like sexual harassment, where individuals may be, for various reasons, not wanting to disclose their name and their identity. So I would look into, that section of the worker grievance guidance for that.
Brilliant. Okay, so next question. Are there certain stages of the employment cycle for the oil and gas industry where a worker might be more at risk? Maybe that's not just the oil and gas industry, I think that's general. But for example, when they're finding work, or when they arrive at work, or when the work comes to an end?
Yeah, you could argue all of them are high risk or where there is risk. I'd say during the sort of recruitment process and when candidates are looking for work, that's where some sort of key vulnerabilities may emerge. They may pay fees, for example, to secure their work. They may be misled or told that their eventual working conditions are better than they hoped for. This means that when a worker arrives on the site, if those conditions aren't realised, they may realise that they've paid a fee which they won't be able to repay as quickly as they thought, which makes them essentially more willing to work longer hours, to take more risks, and also allows any sort of unscrupulous employer to take advantage of that position. And if individuals are in the process of leaving work, or there's a sort of a large redundancy, a sort of retrenchment, then it is the case that individuals don't receive their back pay, they don't receive severances, and other sort of benefits that they're entitled to. So there are, a number of risks across the sort of employment life cycle.
Yeah, and it sounds, the message there seems to be that the risks are different at the different stages as well, aren't they?
Yeah. And I think that's why it's important to, when we sort of focus on that sort of migrant worker journey, to really think about the experiences that workers have had across all of those, to sort of build a picture of where some of those vulnerabilities and sort of risks may lie. And
I presume as well they can sort of intersect, so they may be picked up at the point that they're working, but they may have experienced quite a lot of different.
Exactly, yeah, and that's often the case. Yeah.
Okay, so next question. How might emerging human rights norms and regulations such as the UK Modern Slavery Act complement or work in parallel to the guidance?
Well, the guidance was developed with the hope that it would sort of meet the expectations of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, a sort of widely accepted framework for companies trying to more systematically address human and labour rights issues associated with their activities, operations and supply chains. So the guidance sort of essentially corresponds, to that framework in terms of risk identification, prioritisation, mitigation and addressing root causes, but then also the section on grievances in terms of how to remediate harm which has already occurred. So I think it aligns with that. In terms of the modern slavery legislation, what it does is the modern slavery legislation in the UK, for example, is obviously not that stringent. It only requires, some very basic information to be put on any company's website. But what leading companies are doing is talking a lot more about their sort of due diligence practices to address modern slavery and labour and human rights issues more broadly. So talking about their policies and procedures, their risk assessments, disclosing types of risks they've identified and then actions that they've taken to either mitigate or remediate those risks, and also how they monitor that. So I think all of that is captured within the documents that we've set out.
Okay, we've got another question that looks like it might be quite similar. Can you please explain how the Ipieca guidelines comply with other existing guidelines, i.e. the UN Guiding Principles? You just talked about that, but also the guidelines from the Danish Institute of Human Rights and others. So which ones you brought in?
So the UNGPs were central to it. The Danish Institute guidance Again, that's aligned with the UNGPs, so I'd say that those two would sort of have some commonality. The guidance on labour assessments, we've tried to standardise as much as possible the good work that has been done in other sectors on this issue, so that we're not sort of reinventing the wheel entirely, and we're sort of adding a degree of consistency for Ipieca members as well as members in other sectors. So we looked at the work that the Responsible Business Alliance have done for electronics. We looked at SEDEX and their sort of various protocols that they do for audits for their members, which could be food, garment, retail, and also the SA8000, the sort of one of the sort of main benchmark frameworks for doing labour audits. In terms of the worker grievances, as I said, it's based on what is set out in the UN Guiding Principles. It sort of is aligned as much as possible with previous Ipieca guidance on community grievances. Again, trying to take the sort of really good work that was put into that guidance, and then also other sort of interesting and good guidance documents, for example, from Ipieca and the standards that they have for their security members.
Brilliant. Okay, next question. Does the toolkit provide any guidance on best practice for communicating working terms and conditions to unskilled workforces that may speak different languages or may be illiterate or not have access to the internet or other technology?
Interesting. Good question. I think there are various elements perhaps within the guidance on responsible recruitment and employment. So within that, we talk about good practice principles for individuals who have workforce relations responsibilities. And that sets out, sort of clear inductions which are culturally and linguistically sensitive to those individuals, so that when they arrive on site, they're immediately informed about what their terms and conditions will be, and what they can expect. Ideally, that happens before recruitment, and that's about working with agencies and subcontractors, or during the interview process, companies themselves, in addition to asking skills-based questions, talking about and being very clear and transparent about expected terms and conditions of employment. So I think that's in there, but I think also one thing about the work agreements mechanism piece is, although the sort of process is very important, what we would emphasize is that having good grievance mechanisms is a lot about picking up on sort of issues informally, and having individuals that can sort of pick up on someone's complaints and address that very quickly. So that could be done in the form of worker welfare officers, trade union members, and so take the work that is already done in the oil and gas sector through community liaison workers. It's a very sort of similar process to that, having trusted individuals that work for the company but are also embedded within the community to help address those issues.
Fantastic. Okay, another question. So what can companies do? You mentioned root causes earlier. So what can companies do to address the root causes of labour rights risks? So contextual factors which might feel outside their control or their area of responsibility.
I would say collaboration is key. Root causes are often, as I think I mentioned before, just they're driven by larger systemic issues that aren't just particular to a project site. So gaining as much buy-in from public sector and business partners and even civil society and trade unions to try and understand the issue, engaging with workers and their representatives to understand what they would like done about it, rather than it being a sort of top-down solution. Unpicking, using that sort of collaborative framework to unpick why the issue is happening and also develop the solution.
Brilliant. Okay, another question. So poor legal protection, another contextual question. Poor legal protection is a contextual factor which might affect labour rights risks for a worker. What can companies do in that situation? So I guess, so to help protect their workers, I guess in terms of, where laws either don't exist or where they're not enforced very well.
Yeah, so I think that can come from setting a sort of company, essentially having a code of conduct or a policy that goes beyond national legal expectations is a sort of a good starting point. But then on a particular project, I would say ensuring that you start early and you build these sort of higher standards within the sort of bidding documents and procurement framework and contracting, so that your expectations are very clear, very early on, are clearly set to the contractors that you'll be working with or suppliers that you'll be working with, and that those standards are also already embedded in contracts and are therefore enforceable during project delivery.
Okay, brilliant. In terms of, so we've got a question here about worker characteristics. Are there any shortcuts in worker characteristics which companies should be aware of that would help you to identify those most at risk?
Shortcuts. I think so. The two there that we've included in relation to low-skilled workers and migrant workers are important, but I think individuals who may be part of a marginalised or sort of more widely discriminated against group would also be sort of key to. Essentially, you're looking for factors as to that sort of increased vulnerability, whether they are whether those individuals have more legal barriers to employment, whether they have fewer legal protections in a society, whether they are less likely to know about their rights, and they're in sort of generally like more dangerous work, so they're more likely to be put in sort of harm's way, essentially. So you're looking at low-skilled workers, migrant workers, individuals who have fewer legal protections, individuals with lower education, perhaps, those sorts of things.
Is there anything on, I guess gender might be another
and that could feed
component.
into in a lot of societies, you know, there are sort of fewer protections for women or more discriminatory legal provisions for women in that society. There are sort of also ingrained cultural norms which mean that women are discriminated against, more likely to be subject to harassment on a workplace. So yeah, definitely.
Okay. Right, there's another question here on remedy. So what might be some of the techniques which companies can use to monitor remedial actions and ensure that labour rights risks are being addressed?
I think grievance mechanisms, fundamentally. I mean, it depends what's in place and what sort of key monitoring tools are applicable, but I'd say the sort of emphasis on grievance mechanisms and essentially the equation of grievance mechanisms and remedy in the UNGPs, you know, does suggest that they are a really sort of useful tool when run effectively to monitor and ensure that remedial actions are actually sort of properly being implemented. That could, in certain work sites, more applicable where there are good trade unions and legitimate trade unions that could be used to sort of do that monitoring on the behalf of a company. But yeah, I'd say grievance mechanisms are, you know, the main tool.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're coming towards the end of the webinar now. I had one final question for you, Matt, which is, you know, what are the top 3 messages that oil and gas companies should take away from these outputs? Can you give us just 3 pithy things?
Well, it'll be of no surprise that I've already covered them to some extent through some of those other questions. But I would say that, you know, as I mentioned, the sector, there's already a lot done in terms of systems and management of other sort of environmental and social issues. And I think it's about using those systems to better integrate labour. So a lot of the focus has been, as I said, understandably on sort of outside of the fence issues such as community. But it's about using, you know, the ESHA and ESAT process to pick up and address some of the sort of labour issues. And that's done at a sort of early stage of design, you know, getting that integrated into procurement and sort of contract management practices early on, and getting that written into contracts with specific clauses really helps address those issues early. And health and safety systems that are, you know, very well operated, as I've typically experienced on an oil and gas site, you know, using those management systems to embed more labour practices, so using HSE personnel to include various trainings perhaps on specific labour issues, or using them to monitor particular practices, potentially harassment or other issues on the sites. And that's associated with, you know, planning and preparing. You know, as I was saying earlier, that's really important. This gives the best opportunity to address the issues should they arise, and it allows a company to take essentially a strategic approach to addressing labour risks and prioritising on sort of key salient issues in a more proactive manner. So instead of just doing a sort of a random audit of a site, finding an issue and sort of having a sort of compliance-led sort of response to that, actually sort of understanding what that issue is based on some prior risk assessment and working with the company, tends to lead to better results. And so again, that sort of comes down to my final one, which is collaboration. So internally, work with senior management, work with colleagues in other departments, work with industry and business partners. I think Ipieca do a lot of great work. There's other examples elsewhere. And your business partners who, they want more consistency from both their clients and their contractors in terms of, labour management. And then also engaging with workers, probably through their representatives or directly, to better understand what their issues are and the ways of overcoming this. And sort of good communication with those workers and engaging them in solutions is sort of central to addressing like bigger problems and those root causes that we talked about.
Fantastic. So it's integrating with your existing systems, plan and prepare, and collaborate.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Key messages.
Brilliant. Well, let me say a huge thank you to you, Matt, for fielding so many questions, and to everyone on the line for your time and participation today. I think there are a couple of questions that we haven't got to, in which case we will follow up offline. And if there is anything else that you want to know, any follow-up questions that you had, then please do get in touch with us. Just a quick note to say that we've recorded this webinar, and as I mentioned at the beginning, an on-demand version will be available tomorrow and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. And Ipieca members, you will also be able to find it on the Social Responsibility Resources page on the members area of the Ipieca website, should you wish to listen again or share it with any of your colleagues. So again, many thanks to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.